Welcome to this journey through one of the darkest and most deliberately erased chapters in the recorded history of the American South. What you are about to hear is not a story that was lost to time through carelessness or the slow decay of forgotten archives. This is a story that was buried on purpose, hidden beneath the careful language of bureaucratic documents, sealed inside the dry ink of census ledgers, and protected for generations by a system that had every reason to make sure these names were never spoken aloud again. Because if the names were spoken, the people became real. And if the people became real, the crime became undeniable. The year is 1850. The United States of America is 31 states strong, expanding westward with a confidence that its leaders describe as destiny. In Washington, politicians debate the future of new territories. In northern cities, factories hum with the labor of immigrants chasing a version of freedom that, however difficult, at least belongs to them. And in the sprawling plantations of Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, and South Carolina, something else is happening entirely. Something that the government of the United States has decided to document, to count, to catalog, and yet, in the same breath, to erase. The slave schedule of the 1850 United States Census is a document that most Americans have never heard of. It exists in the National Archives. It is accessible. It is real. And what it contains is so methodically cruel that historians who spend their careers studying this era still describe the experience of reading it as physically uncomfortable. The document does not list the names of enslaved people. It lists their age, their sex, their color as described by the census taker, and their perceived physical condition. That is all. Where a name should be, there is nothing, a blank space where a human being once stood. But here is what makes the 1850 slave schedule uniquely devastating when examined up close: the children. Researchers and genealogists who have spent years combing through these records describe a pattern that becomes impossible to ignore once you see it. Infants listed as 3 months old. Children listed as 2 years, 4 years, 7 years. Entered into the ledger beneath the name of a white slaveholder, counted as part of his property assessment, assigned a dollar value, and given no name of their own. Not even a first name. Not even a single letter to mark that they had ever existed as individuals at all. One historian, working in the 1990s to reconstruct the population of a single plantation in Natchez, Mississippi, described sitting in a reading room at the Library of Congress with the microfilm of the 1850 slave schedule scrolled in front of her. She had been searching for any trace of a family her research suggested had lived on that property for 3 generations. What she found instead was a column of numbers, ages: 8, 5, 3, 1, 4 months. She said later in an interview that she had to step outside and sit on the steps for almost 20 minutes before she could go back in. Because what those numbers represented, once you truly allowed yourself to understand it, was a family. A mother and her children, in all likelihood, reduced to inventory. This is the weight of what we are going to examine today. Not as an abstraction, not as a historical footnote to be acknowledged and moved past, but as a lived reality that has consequences extending all the way into the present. Because the erasure that happened in those census ledgers did not stay in 1850. It traveled forward through time. It shaped what descendants could know about themselves. It shaped what communities could grieve. It shaped what courts could prove and what reparations movements could document. The blank space where a name should have been did not close when the census taker finished his rounds. It widened. To understand how this happened, and why it was designed this way, we need to go back further than 1850. We need to understand what a census was supposed to be in the first place, and how the architects of American slavery managed to turn an instrument of democratic accountability into one of the most efficient tools of dehumanization ever produced by a government in peacetime. Because that transformation did not happen by accident. It was argued over. It was legislated. It was defended in the halls of Congress by men who understood exactly what they were doing and chose to do it anyway. The United States Constitution, ratified in 1788,
contains a clause in Article 1 that would determine the fate of millions of people who had no voice in writing it. The 3/5 Compromise. For the purposes of congressional representation and taxation, enslaved people would be counted as 3/5 of a person. Not a full person. Not 0. 3/5. A fraction designed not out of any philosophical consideration for the humanity of enslaved people, but as a political bargain between slave-holding Southern states who wanted maximum representation and Northern states who wanted to limit Southern power. The enslaved person was not the subject of this negotiation. They were the currency. By the time the 1850 census was being designed, this framework had already been in place for 60 years. An entire bureaucratic culture had grown up around the logic of treating human beings as countable units rather than as individuals with names and histories and inner lives. The census takers who walked from plantation to plantation with their ledgers were not, in most cases, villains in the dramatic sense. They were functionaries. Men doing a job as it had been defined for them, within a system that had already made its most important moral decision long before they picked up their pens. And yet the specific choice to exclude names from the slave schedule was not inevitable. It was a decision. Someone designed that form. Someone looked at the columns and chose what went to him and what to leave out. And what they left out, with the precision of people who understood the power of paperwork, was the one thing that would have made every number on that page into a person.
Welcome back. Because what we left behind in that last moment, that single missing name on a government ledger, is not where the story ends. It is where it begins. And to truly understand the architecture of that erasure, we need to walk inside it. We need to see not just what the slave schedule of 1850 looked like from the outside, as a document, as a historical artifact sitting behind archival glass, but what it looked like from the inside, from the perspective of the people who were counted in it, from the perspective of the children whose ages were written down in careful ink, while their names were left to disappear into the silence of a southern morning. Let us begin with a specific place, Census Parish, Louisiana. In 1850, Census Parish was one of the wealthiest counties in the entire United States. Not wealthy in the way that northern industrial cities were wealthy, with factories and railroads and the expanding infrastructure of a modernizing economy. Wealthy in the way that required the complete and total subjugation of other human beings to function. The cotton fields of Census Parish stretched for miles in every direction, worked by enslaved people who outnumbered the white population of the parish by a ratio of nearly 10 to 1. 10 to 1. For every white resident of Census Parish who would appear in the 1850 census with a full name, a place of birth, an occupation, and a recorded identity, there were 10 human beings whose existence would be reduced to a number in a separate ledger. The census taker who covered a large portion of Census Parish in the summer of 1850 was a man whose name appears in the historical record, though we will not use it here, because the point of this examination is not to center the people who administered the system, but to understand the system itself and what it did to the people trapped inside it. This man traveled on horseback from property to property through the brutal Louisiana summer heat. He carried with him the official forms issued by the federal government, the free population schedule, which asked for names, ages, occupations, birthplaces, and other identifying information, and the slave schedule, which asked for none of those things, just numbers, just ages, just a column for sex, and a column for color, and a column for whether the enslaved person was described as deaf, blind, insane, or otherwise impaired. On one particular plantation in Census Parish, the census taker recorded 53 enslaved people. We know this because the record survives. We can read it today. 53 human beings entered into the ledger over the course of what was probably no more than an hour of the census taker's time, processed and recorded and moved past.
Among those 53 entries, 14 are children under the age of 10. 8 of those 14 children are under the age of 5. 3 of them are listed as being under 1 year old. 1 is listed as 3 months. 3 months old, born into a world that had already decided, before she took her first breath, that she would be property, that her name would not be worth recording, that her existence would be acknowledged only to the extent that it increased the assessed value of the man who claimed to own her. And then the census taker's horse moved on down the road, and she was left behind in the ledger as a number, and the summer heat continued, and the cotton grew. Now, here is what historians and genealogical researchers have been doing for the last several decades with records like this one, because the absence of a name in the slave schedule does not mean the complete absence of evidence. Human beings, even within systems designed to erase them, leave traces. They appear in other documents, in plantation account books, where slaveholders sometimes recorded names alongside tasks and rations, in church baptismal records, where some enslaved children were given names at ceremonies that the institution sometimes found it useful to document, in the private letters and diaries of slaveholders, where names appear not out of any recognition of personhood, but because it was simply more practical to refer to people by name than by physical description when giving instructions to overseers. And this is where the investigative work becomes both extraordinary and heartbreaking in equal measure, because researchers who attempt to reconstruct the identities of enslaved people listed in the 1850 slave schedule are not doing simple archival work. They are doing something closer to forensic archaeology. They are sifting through the sediment of a system specifically designed to leave nothing behind, looking for the fragments that survived by accident, the names that slipped through because someone wrote them down for a reason that had nothing to do with preserving their humanity, and everything to do with the administrative convenience of the people who own them. One of the most significant efforts in this area has been the work done by the Freedmen's Bureau records, compiled in the years immediately following the Civil War. When formerly enslaved people began to register themselves as free citizens, to formalize marriages that had been denied legal recognition, to search for family members who had been sold away from them, they created a paper trail that researchers have been mining ever since. And sometimes, just sometimes, those records can be matched backward to the anonymous entries in the 1850 slave schedule. A woman who registers with the Freedmen's Bureau in 1866 as being approximately 23 years old, born in Louisiana, formerly enslaved on a particular plantation, might correspond to a girl listed in the 1850 slave schedule as 7 years old on that same property. Might. That word carries the entire weight of this research. Might. Because certainty is almost never available. The system was too thorough in its erasure for certainty to survive in most cases. What researchers are left with instead is probability, likelihood, the careful, painstaking construction of a story that is almost certainly true, but can never be fully proven, because the proof was never allowed to exist in the first place. And that is itself a form of ongoing injustice that we need to sit with before we move any further.
There is a particular kind of grief that has no name in the English language. Other cultures have words for it. The Portuguese have saudade, a longing for something loved and lost that may never return. The Japanese have mono no aware, the bittersweet awareness of impermanence. But English, the language in which these census ledgers were written, in which the laws that enabled them were argued and passed and signed, does not have a single word for the specific grief of not knowing who you come from, of reaching back through your own history and finding not a name, not a face, not a story, but a number, an age, a column in a ledger that was never designed to remember you. This is the grief that millions of Black Americans carry today as a direct consequence of what happened in documents like the 1850 slave schedule. And it is important, before we go any further into the historical and legal architecture of this erasure, to stop and acknowledge that grief as real, not as metaphor, not as political rhetoric, as an actual, lived psychological experience that shapes how people move through the world. Because when we talk about the names that were never recorded, we are not talking about an abstraction. We are talking about grandmothers. We are talking about great-great-grandfathers. We are talking about the specific, irreplaceable human beings from whom entire living communities descended, and whose erasure from the official record was so complete that their descendants often cannot prove in any documentable way where they came from. Genealogical researchers who work with African American families describe this experience with a consistency that is itself telling. There is almost always a wall, a moment in the research where the trail goes cold, where the documents stop, where the names disappear. And that wall, in the vast majority of cases, sits precisely at the boundary of emancipation. Before 1865, in most Southern states, the record simply does not exist in any form that centers the enslaved person as an individual. After 1865, the Freedmen's Bureau records, the first federal census to include formerly enslaved people by name, the church records and marriage registrations and land purchase documents, all of these begin to accumulate. The person emerges from the fog of official erasure as a named, documented human being. But before that moment, before emancipation, the wall. And behind that wall are the children of the 1850 slave schedule, the 3-month-old in Tensas Parish, the 7-year-old in Adams County, Mississippi, the 4-year-old on a rice plantation outside Savannah, Georgia. They are there. We know they are there because the numbers tell us they are there. But we cannot call them by name because the system that counted them made a deliberate and specific decision not to record that information. Not because names were unavailable, not because the census takers did not know them, but because recording a name would have implied a kind of individuality, a kind of personhood that the legal and economic structure of American slavery could not afford to acknowledge.
This is the critical point that needs to be understood clearly. The decision to exclude names from the slave schedule was not a logistical oversight. It was not a matter of the forms being too small or the census takers being too busy. We know this because the free population schedule, administered simultaneously by the same census takers on the same rounds, asked for names. It asked for ages, occupations, birthplaces, whether the person had attended school in the past year, whether they could read and write. The free population schedule treated its subjects as individuals with histories and futures worth documenting. The slave schedule treated its subjects as livestock. And that difference was not accidental. It was constitutional. It was legal. It was, in the language of the time, correct. To understand how a government arrives at that position, we need to go back to the legal framework that made it not just possible, but mandatory. Because the erasure we are examining did not begin with the census. It began with property law, specifically with the legal doctrine that classified enslaved people not as persons under the law, but as chattels, movable property, the same legal category as a horse, a plow, a bale of cotton. This classification had profound implications that extended far beyond the obvious horror of it. It meant that enslaved people could not own property, could not enter into contracts, could not testify in court, could not legally marry, could not claim their own children as their own. That last point is worth dwelling on for a moment. Under the chattel slavery laws of most Southern states, a child born to an enslaved woman was not legally that woman's child. The child was the property of the woman's enslaver, automatically, from the moment of birth. The mother had no legal claim to her own infant. The father, if he was also enslaved, had no legal claim either. The child entered the world already belonging to someone else, already stripped of the most fundamental human relationship before it was old enough to understand what had been taken from it. And the census reflected this legal reality with bureaucratic precision. The 1850 slave schedule did not group enslaved people into family units. It listed them individually, in a column beneath the name of their enslaver, ordered by age in descending fashion in most cases. A mother and her children might appear consecutively in the ledger, their ages suggesting their relationship, but there was no official recognition of that relationship, no designation of mother, child, sibling, spouse, because legally those relationships did not exist. The law had decided that enslaved people did not have families. They had proximity. They had biological connection. But family, in the legal sense, required personhood, and personhood had been revoked. This is the mechanism by which the erasure in the census ledgers connected to a broader system of erasure that operated at every level of American society simultaneously. The law denied personhood. The census reflected the law. The census shaped the historical record. The historical record shaped what future generations could know, prove, and grieve. Each layer reinforced the others,
creating an interlocking architecture of invisibility that was, by any reasonable analysis, one of the most effective systems of human erasure ever constructed by a modern government. And it worked. It worked so well that we are still living inside its consequences today.
There is a county in central Mississippi that does not appear in most American history textbooks. It is not famous for a battle or a political scandal or a landmark court decision. It is famous, among the small and dedicated community of researchers who study it, for a single plantation ledger that survived when almost everything else was destroyed. A handwritten account book kept by a cotton planter between the years of 1847 and 1863 that contains something extraordinary. Names. Not just the names of the enslaved adults who worked the fields, but the names of their children. First names in most cases, sometimes a descriptive notation beside them, the age at which they were first put to work, the tasks they were assigned, the rations they received, and occasionally, just occasionally, a note about their parentage. This ledger exists today in a university archive in Mississippi. Researchers who have examined it describe the experience of reading it in terms that echo what we heard earlier about the census microfiche, a combination of profound gratitude for the information it contains and profound rage at the conditions that make it so rare. Because this ledger is not evidence of a slaveholder's humanity, it is evidence of his administrative habits. He recorded names because names were useful to him, because it was easier to manage a workforce of 112 people if you could refer to them individually rather than by physical description. The names in that ledger were not recorded as an act of recognition, they were recorded as an act of inventory management. And yet those names survived. And because they survived, the people attached to them survived, in a way that the nameless numbers in the 1850 slave schedule did not. Researchers have been able to cross-reference the names in this ledger against the slave schedule entry for the same plantation. They have been able to identify, with reasonable confidence, which anonymous number in the census corresponds to which named individual in the account book. And what emerges from that cross-referencing is devastating in its specificity. Take the entry in the 1850 slave schedule for a girl listed as 7 years old. In the plantation ledger, a girl of approximately the right age appears with the name Celia. Beside her name, in the slaveholder's handwriting, is a notation that she is the daughter of a woman named Harriet and that she has been assigned to the kitchen. Celia, 7 years old, daughter of Harriet, assigned to the kitchen of a man who owned her and would never once consider that she had any claim to her own existence. That name, Celia, is not in the census. It never was. The government of the United States looked at Celia in 1850 and recorded her as a number, a 7, in a column beneath her enslaver's name, and moved on. But the account book kept her name alive, by accident, by administrative convenience, by the mundane practicality of a man who needed to know who was working in his kitchen. And now, more than 170 years later, a researcher sitting in a university archive can say her name, Celia. And somewhere in the living world, there may be descendants of Celia and Harriet who have spent years searching for exactly this kind of fragment, this accidental survival of an identity that was supposed to be erased.
This is the pattern that emerges when you spend enough time in these archives. Survival by accident. Identity preserved not because the system intended to preserve it, but because the system occasionally needed information for its own purposes, and the information happened to survive. Plantation ledgers, church baptismal records, slaveholder correspondence, estate inventories conducted after a slaveholder's death, which sometimes listed enslaved people by name because the lawyers needed to know what they were dividing among the heirs. The names that survived did so in spite of the system, not because of it. They slipped through the cracks of an erasure that was thorough, but not in every single case complete. But here is what the survival of those occasional names also tells us. It tells us that the erasure in the census was a choice, because the names existed. The slaveholders knew them, the overseers knew them, the neighboring plantation owners knew them, the local doctors who were sometimes called to examine sick enslaved people knew them. The names were not secret.
They were not unavailable. They were simply not considered worth recording by a federal government that had decided, at the highest levels of its constitutional architecture, that these people were not people in the way that mattered for official purposes. And this distinction between names that existed and names that were not recorded is crucial, because it shifts the moral weight of the erasure from the passive language of historical loss. Things were different then. Records were incomplete. We simply did not have the technology or the administrative capacity, into something far more direct and far more damning. The names were there. The government chose not to write them down. That is not loss. That is deletion. And deletion implies a deleter. It implies agency. It implies a decision made by specific people within a specific system for specific reasons that we are entirely capable of examining and naming. The reasons were economic. The plantation economy of the American South was built on a legal fiction, the fiction that human beings could be property, and that fiction required constant maintenance. One of the ways you maintained it was by ensuring that the official documents of the state reflected it consistently. If the census had listed enslaved people by name, it would have created a bureaucratic category problem. Names implied individuals. Individuals implied personhood. Personhood implied rights. And rights implied the entire system was not just morally bankrupt, but legally incoherent. Which it was. But the people who benefited from it were not interested in legal coherence. They were interested in cotton prices and land values, and the political power that came from controlling both. So the census taker came and went, and the names stayed behind in the silence of the plantation, known to everyone and recorded by no one who was required to make them permanent. And the children grew, or did not grow, and the seasons turned, and the cotton was picked and sold and shipped and turned into cloth and sold again, and the wealth accumulated in the hands of people whose names are all over the historical record, whose portraits hang in museums, whose letters fill archives, whose descendants can trace their lineage back through generations of documented, named, officially recognized human beings, while Celia's descendants search for her in a number, a 7, in a column in a ledger that was never designed to remember her at all.
There is a question that serious historians and legal scholars have been wrestling with for decades, and it is a question that sounds simple until you sit with it long enough to feel its full weight. The question is this: what do you do with an injustice that was legal? Not an injustice that happened in spite of the law, not a crime committed in the shadows, outside the official structures of society, by individuals acting against the rules of their time, but an injustice that was the law, that was written into the Constitution, that was upheld by the Supreme Court, that was administered by federal census takers carrying official government forms. What do you do with that? This question matters enormously when we talk about the 1850 slave schedule and the erasure of names from the official record. Because one of the most common ways that societies process historical injustice is through the framework of aberration. We tell ourselves that what happened was a deviation from our values, not an expression of them. That the people who did it were acting outside the system, not inside it. That the system itself was fundamentally sound and was merely corrupted by bad actors in a particular moment. This narrative is comfortable. It allows a society to acknowledge wrongdoing without implicating its foundational institutions. It allows people to say, that was terrible, and also, but our system is good, without feeling the contradiction between those two statements. The 1850 slave schedule does not allow for that comfort. It is not the product of aberrant behavior. It is the product of the system working exactly as designed. The Constitution designed it. Congress implemented it. The executive branch administered it. The Supreme Court, in case after case throughout the antebellum period, upheld it. The erasure of names from the census was not a glitch in the American democratic experiment. It was a feature. And recognizing it as a feature rather than a bug changes everything about how we understand both the history and its consequences. Let us talk about consequences, because this is where the history stops being purely academic and starts being something that touches the present moment in ways that are measurable and documented.
The erasure of names from the 1850 slave schedule did not end when the Civil War ended. It did not end when the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. It did not end when the 14th Amendment granted citizenship to formerly enslaved people. It continued, in cascading form, through every subsequent generation that descended from the people who were counted as numbers in that ledger. Consider what it means practically to not know where you come from. In the United States, genealogical research serves functions that go far beyond personal curiosity. It is used to establish eligibility for certain tribal affiliations and the benefits associated with them. It is used in legal cases involving inheritance and property rights. It is used by medical researchers who need accurate family health histories. It is used by people seeking dual citizenship in countries where their ancestors originated. It is used in countless ways, both formal and informal, as a form of social and legal currency. Knowing who your great-great-grandparents were is not merely a matter of sentiment. It is a form of documented identity that carries real-world value. And for millions of African Americans, that form of identity was deliberately destroyed before it could be created. The 1850 slave schedule did not just fail to record names in the moment. It created a permanent gap in the genealogical record that has compounded across generations. A woman searching for her ancestors today does not merely face the challenge of old records being hard to find. She faces the reality that the records she is looking for were never created. That the government of the United States looked at her great-great-great-grandmother and decided that her name was not worth the ink. And that decision, made by a census taker on horseback in the summer of 1850, is still shaping what she can know about herself in the present day.
The genealogical community has a term for this. They call it the slavery research barrier. And it is not a metaphor. It is a literal, documented phenomenon that affects a specific population in a specific way as a direct result of specific historical policies. Researchers who work with African American genealogy describe it with a precision that makes clear they are not speaking loosely. Before 1870, in the first federal census after the Civil War that listed all Americans by name regardless of race, the trail goes cold for most black families. Not because their ancestors did not exist, not because they did not have names or histories or communities or relationships, but because the official record was not designed to preserve any of that information. Some researchers have dedicated their entire careers to developing methodologies for crossing this barrier. The most promising of these methodologies involve what genealogists call cluster research, examining not just the individual you are searching for, but everyone around them, other enslaved people on the same plantation, Freedmen's Bureau records for the entire county, not just a single family, post-emancipation census records for communities where formerly enslaved people tended to settle together, church records from denominations that were active in particular regions, newspaper archives from the Reconstruction era, land records, tax records, court records, everything that might contain a fragment of a name, a fragment of a relationship, a fragment of a life that was supposed to be erased, but left traces anyway, because human beings, even within systems designed to erase them, insist on existing. And sometimes the methodology works. Sometimes a researcher follows a thread from a Freedmen's Bureau registration in 1866 backward through a Freedmen's Bank record, through a church baptismal entry, through a plantation account book, through an estate inventory, all the way back to a number in the 1850 slave schedule. And in that moment, the number becomes a person. The person gets a name. The name gets a history. And something that was stolen 170 years ago is partially, imperfectly, incompletely restored. Partially, imperfectly, incompletely. Those qualifications matter, because even the most successful genealogical reconstruction of an enslaved person's identity is not the same as having had that identity preserved in the first place. The researcher who discovers that the 7 in the census was Celia, daughter of Harriet, has done something remarkable and important. But Celia's descendants are still living in a world where their ancestor was officially counted as a number, where the government of the United States looked at her and decided she was not worth naming. That reality does not disappear when a researcher finds the account book.
It coexists with the discovery, a reminder that the restoration, however meaningful, is also evidence of what was taken. And what was taken was not just a name. What was taken was the unbroken chain of documented identity that connects a person to their past, to their community, to their understanding of who they are and where they come from. That chain, for millions of families, was severed in 1850 by a government form. And the severing was not accidental.
There is a woman named Dorothy Sproul Redford who, in 1988, organized something that had never been done before in the United States on the scale she attempted it. She gathered more than 2,000 people on the grounds of Somerset Place, a former plantation in Washington County, North Carolina, for a homecoming. Not a homecoming in the casual sense, a homecoming in the deepest, most deliberate sense of that word. A gathering of the descendants of the enslaved people who had lived and worked and died on that plantation, brought together for the first time in a formal, organized, documented acknowledgement of their shared origin in that specific place. 2,000 people. Some of them had driven from across the country. Some had flown in from other states. Some were elderly and had spent their entire lives within a few miles of Somerset Place without ever having had a formal occasion to stand on its grounds and say, "My people were here." Dorothy Redford had spent years preparing for that day, years of research, years of correspondence, years of following the same fragmented trails through the same incomplete archives that we have been discussing throughout this examination. And what she found, again and again in the course of that research, was the wall, the slavery research barrier, the place where the names stopped and the numbers began. She found entries in the antebellum census records for Somerset Place that listed enslaved people by age and sex and nothing else. She found the blank spaces where names should have been. And she found, in those blank spaces, the central challenge of her project. How do you bring people home to an ancestor you cannot name? Her answer to that question became the methodology that has influenced African American genealogical research ever since. She worked sideways. She worked around the barrier rather than through it. She gathered oral histories from elderly community members who carried in their memories information that had never made it into any official document. She examined plantation records that had survived in private family collections, never donated to archives, never made publicly accessible only because she knocked on doors and asked. She cross-referenced everything she found against everything else she found, building a picture of the Somerset Place community not from any single authoritative source, but from the accumulated weight of dozens of partial, imperfect, fragmentary sources that together told a story no single one of them could have told alone. And she found names. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough to give the 2,000 people who gathered at Somerset Place in 1988 something to hold on to, enough to allow people to stand on the ground where their ancestors had stood and say a name, to say, this person was here, this person was real, this person was not a number. And the gathering itself, the act of 2,000 descendants coming together in that place, became its own form of documentation, its own act of historical recovery, a counter-record to the official erasure, created not by a government agency, but by the people whose erasure the government had engineered. This is one of the most important things to understand about the long aftermath of the 1850 slave schedule and the naming practices it represented. The erasure was not total. It was not total because the people who were erased were still people, and people remember. They told their children their names. They told their grandchildren where they came from. They kept alive in oral tradition and community memory, and the private, unofficial records of their own hearts, the information that the government had decided not to preserve. And that oral tradition, however vulnerable to the passage of time and the disruptions of migration and community dissolution, has been one of the most important sources for researchers attempting to reconstruct what the census destroyed. But oral tradition has its limits, and those limits have been tested severely by the specific conditions that American slavery created. Enslaved families were routinely separated by sale.
A mother sold away from her children had no way to ensure that the names she carried, her own parents' names, her grandparents' names, the names of siblings sold in other directions, would survive in the memories of the children she was taken from. A man sold from Virginia to Mississippi, arriving in a community where he knew no one, carrying in his memory the names of a family he might never see again, had no guarantee that those names would be passed on to the children he might have in his new location. The deliberate destruction of family continuity through the slave trade did not just cause immediate suffering, it created the conditions under which oral tradition itself became unreliable, because the chains of transmission through which oral tradition travels were systematically broken. This is the compounding nature of the harm. The legal framework denied personhood. The census reflected the denial. The slave trade destroyed family continuity. The destruction of family continuity undermined oral tradition. The undermining of oral tradition left future generations without even the informal records that might have supplemented the official ones. Each harm enabled and amplified the next, creating a system of erasure that operated simultaneously at the level of official documentation and at the level of lived community memory, a system so thorough that its effects are still being felt and mapped and grieved today. And yet the research continues. And yet the names keep emerging, one by one, from the archives and the oral histories and the account books and the church records and the estate inventories. And yet Dorothy Redford organized a homecoming for 2,000 people. And yet genealogical organizations specifically focused on African American research have proliferated over the last several decades, developing methodologies and building databases, and training researchers in the specific skills required to work on the other side of the slavery research barrier. And yet DNA testing has opened an entirely new avenue of research that the designers of the 1850 slave schedule could not have anticipated, an avenue that bypasses documentary records entirely and reads identity directly from the biological inheritance that no census taker could erase. The DNA testing revolution deserves particular attention in this context, because what it represents in relation to the erasure we have been examining is something genuinely unprecedented. For the first time in history, descendants of enslaved people have access to a form of identity documentation that does not depend on the official record, that cannot be suppressed by a government decision about what to include on a census form, that exists in the body itself, carried forward through generations regardless of what any ledger said or did not say. A woman whose great-great-great-grandmother appears in the 1850 slave schedule as a number, as an age without a name, can today submit a DNA sample and learn which regions of Africa her ancestry traces to, can connect with genetic relatives she did not know she had, can build from biological evidence a picture of origin and connection that the official record was designed to prevent her from having. This is not a complete solution. DNA testing cannot tell you a name. It cannot tell you a specific village or a specific family or a specific story. It can tell you a region, a genetic population, a set of probable connections to other people who share your biological inheritance. And that information, while genuinely meaningful and genuinely restorative for many people, is not the same as knowing that your ancestor's name was Celia. It is not the same as being able to say with the confidence of documented evidence, this person was here, this person was real, this person was not a number. But it is something. In the face of an erasure this thorough, something is not nothing. Something is in fact everything.
There is a courthouse in Natchez, Mississippi, that sits on a bluff above the Mississippi River. And if you stand on that bluff on a clear day, you can see for miles in every direction across the flat delta landscape. The courthouse has been there, in various forms, since before the Civil War. It has processed deeds and wills and estate inventories and tax records and court judgments for longer than most American institutions have existed. And in its basement, in the archives that county courthouses across the South have maintained with varying degrees of care and accessibility over the generations, there are documents that researchers have been quietly excavating for decades, documents that were never meant to be used the way they are being used now, documents that were created to serve the administrative needs of a slave-holding society and have survived into a present where they serve an entirely different purpose, the purpose of recovery, the purpose of naming. One category of document found in courthouse archives across the antebellum South has proven particularly valuable to genealogical researchers working on the other side of the slavery research barrier: estate inventories. When a slaveholder died, his estate had to be inventoried and appraised before it could be distributed among his heirs or sold to satisfy his debts. That inventory included everything he owned: his land, his livestock, his farm equipment, his furniture, his silver, and his enslaved people. listed by name in most cases, because the lawyers and appraisers conducting the inventory needed to be able to identify specifically who was being valued and distributed. A woman named Sarah, aged approximately 30, valued at $800. A boy named James, aged approximately 12, valued at $600. A girl named Lucy, aged approximately 5, valued at $300. The values assigned to these people in estate inventories are among the most disturbing numbers in American historical records. Not because the practice of assigning monetary value to human beings is surprising at this point in our examination. We have established thoroughly that this was the operating logic of the entire system. But because the specificity of the valuations makes the dehumanization concrete in a way that generalizations cannot. $800 for Sarah, $600 for James, $300 for Lucy. These are not abstract figures. In 1850, $800 was roughly equivalent to the annual income of a skilled northern tradesman. It was a significant sum. It was the price of a human life within a system that refused to recognize that life as such, and the precision of the appraisal, the careful assessment of age and health and skill and likely productive capacity, makes the contradiction unbearable. You cannot appraise something with that level of care and attention and simultaneously claim that it is not a person. The appraisal itself is an act of recognition. It is just a recognition that stops precisely at the point where it would have to confer rights. But for researchers today, those estate inventories with their names, ages, and valuations are gold. They are one of the primary sources through which the blank spaces in the 1850 slave schedule can begin to be filled in. A researcher who knows that a particular enslaver died in 1853 can look for his estate inventory in the local courthouse archive. If the inventory lists an enslaved girl named Lucy, aged approximately 5, and the 1850 slave schedule for that enslaver lists a girl aged approximately 2, the researcher has a probable match. Not a certain one, probable. And that probability, carefully documented and honestly qualified, is added to the accumulated weight of evidence that slowly, painstakingly, reconstructs an identity from fragments. This work is being done right now, not in the past tense, not as a historical project that has been completed and filed away. It is happening today, in courthouse archives and university libraries, and in private homes where old family papers have been preserved, and in online databases where researchers share discoveries and cross-reference findings, and sometimes, in the best moments of this work, identify a connection that unlocks a door that has been closed for generations. The scale of what remains to be done is staggering. There were approximately 3.2 million enslaved people in the United States in 1850, 3.2 million entries in the slave schedule, none of them with names. And the work of connecting those entries to the names that existed, that were known, that were simply not considered worth recording by the government that counted them, is the work of decades still to come. Some of that work is being accelerated by technology in ways that would have been unimaginable to the researchers who first began this project in the 1970s and 1980s. Artificial intelligence tools are now being used to read and transcribe handwritten historical documents at a scale and speed that no human team of researchers could match. Optical character recognition software has been applied to digitized versions of plantation ledgers, court records, church documents, and newspaper archives, making searchable text out of what were previously accessible only as images of handwritten pages. Databases that aggregate and cross-reference records from multiple sources simultaneously are allowing researchers to identify connections that would have required years of manual searching to find. The Freedmen's Bureau records, which are among the most important sources for African American genealogical research in the immediate post-emancipation period, have been undergoing a massive digitization and transcription project in recent years, with volunteers contributing hundreds of thousands of hours of labor to make these records searchable by name for the first time. The implications of that project for the work of crossing the slavery research barrier are significant, because the Freedmen's Bureau records, created between 1865 and 1872, document formerly enslaved people at the moment of their emergence into official personhood. They record names that were previously unrecorded. They record ages that can be cross-referenced backward against the slave schedule. They record family relationships that were legally non-existent before emancipation, but were real, had always been real, and were now being formally acknowledged for the first time. When a formerly enslaved man walked into a Freedmen's Bureau office in 1866 and registered his family, he was doing something that the legal system had never before allowed him to do. He was saying, officially and on the record, "These are my children. This is my wife. These people belong to me, and I belong to them, not as property, but as family." And the Freedmen's Bureau agent who recorded that information was creating, perhaps without fully understanding its significance, a document that would one day serve as a bridge between the anonymous numbers of the 1850 slave schedule and the named, documented individuals who would appear in the 1870 census. That bridge is narrow.
It is incomplete. It does not span every gap or connect every fragment, but it exists. And the people who built it, the formerly enslaved men and women who walked into Freedmen's Bureau offices across the South and insisted on being recorded as individuals with names and families and histories, were performing an act of resistance against the erasure that had been imposed on them. They were saying, in the most direct and practical way available to them, we existed, we have names, write them down. And some of those names, written down in 1866 by a Freedmen's Bureau agent in a ledger that has survived into the present, can today be matched backward through the documentary record to a blank space in the 1850 slave schedule that the government of the United States never intended to be filled. That matching, when it happens, is not just a genealogical discovery, it is a form of justice. Small, incomplete, arriving more than a century and a half too late, but justice nonetheless. The restoration of a name to a number, the insistence against everything the system intended that this person was real, that they mattered, that they are still remembered.
There is a moment that several researchers who work in this field describe with a striking consistency, a moment that occurs somewhere in the middle of a long day in an archive, when the weight of what you are reading becomes suddenly and physically real in a way that intellectual understanding alone cannot prepare you for. It is not always triggered by a dramatic discovery. Sometimes it is triggered by something small. A notation in the margin of a plantation ledger, in handwriting different from the main text, smaller and more hesitant, as if written by someone who was not supposed to be writing at all. A name scratched into the wood of a building that was once a slave cabin, found during a historical preservation survey, initials and a date, and nothing else. A quilt pattern identified by textile historians as a form of encoded communication used by enslaved people to mark safe routes and hiding places, its meaning preserved not in any official document, but in the oral tradition of the families who made and kept such quilts across generations. These small things, these fragments that survived not because the system preserved them, but because human beings, even within systems designed to erase them, found ways to leave marks, to say, I was here, to insist against everything on the fact of their own existence. And when a researcher encounters one of those marks, in the middle of a long day of reading numbers and valuations, and the cold administrative language of a society that had decided these people did not deserve names, the encounter can be overwhelming, not because the mark is large or dramatic, but because of what it represents, the refusal to be entirely erased, the insistence on personhood in the face of a system that denied it at every official level. This insistence is one of the most important and least examined aspects of the history we have been tracing. We have spent considerable time examining the system of erasure itself, its legal foundations, its bureaucratic mechanisms, its long-term consequences for descendants and communities. But we have not yet spent enough time with the people inside that system and the ways in which they resisted the erasure, even when they had no access to the official instruments through which identity was documented and preserved. Because the resistance was real, it was creative, it was astonishing in its variety and its persistence, and understanding it is essential to understanding the full story of what the 1850 slave schedule represents and what it does not represent. Enslaved people named their children. This seems like an obvious statement, almost too simple to require saying, but it is in fact a profound act of resistance within the context of a legal system that denied them the right to do so. The law said the child belonged to the enslaver. The law said the mother had no legal claim to her infant. The law said the family did not exist as a legal entity. But the mother named her child anyway. She gave the child a name that meant something within her community, within her family's history, within the oral tradition she carried from her own parents and grandparents. She might give the child an African name, or a name derived from an African naming tradition that connected the child to origins the slaveholder could not see or control. She might name the child after a deceased relative,
threading the child into a chain of memory and connection that the official record was not designed to preserve, but could not entirely sever. Historians who study the naming practices of enslaved people have found patterns that reveal the depth and sophistication of this resistance. Naming after deceased relatives was common, a way of ensuring that a name did not die with the person who first bore it. Naming children after both parents, combining elements of both names into a new one, was documented in some communities. Keeping secret names, names used only within the enslaved community and never disclosed to slaveholders, was a practice that appears in oral histories and in some written accounts from the period. The name the slaveholder used was not always the name the person answered to among their own people. The official name, the one that might appear in a plantation ledger or an estate inventory, existed alongside an unofficial name that belonged to the person in a way the official name never could. This dual naming practice is particularly significant in the context of the census erasure, because it means that even within the system's most thorough attempts at erasure, there was an interior life that the system could not reach, a name that existed in the community, in the family, in the private world of the enslaved person, that was never captured by any official document because it was never disclosed to the people who created official documents. The 1850 slave schedule did not record names, but it also, in a deeper sense, could not have recorded the names that mattered most, because the names that mattered most were precisely the ones that were kept out of reach of the system that sought to erase them. This understanding changes the moral calculus of the census erasure in an important way. The government of the United States chose not to record the names of enslaved people. That choice was an act of deliberate dehumanization, and we have established that clearly. But the enslaved people themselves were not passive in the face of that erasure. They were not simply victims of a system that erased them completely. They maintained, within the space available to them, which was severely constrained but never entirely eliminated, an interior life of identity and memory and naming that the official record could not capture and could not destroy. The oral histories that have been collected from formerly enslaved people and their descendants over the last century and a half are full of names. Names of parents and grandparents and siblings and community members, stretching back in some cases multiple generations before emancipation. Names that do not appear in any official document. Names that survived only because someone remembered them and told someone else who remembered them and told someone else who eventually told a researcher who wrote them down. These oral histories are imperfect as historical sources. Memory is fallible. Transmission across generations is subject to distortion and loss. Details get blurred, and names get changed, and timelines get compressed. But they are also irreplaceable, because they carry information that exists nowhere else. Information that was preserved not by any government or institution, but by the will of the people themselves to be remembered. The Federal Writers Project of the 1930s produced one of the largest collections of oral histories from formerly enslaved people and their descendants that exists anywhere in the world. Between 1936 and 1938, researchers employed by the New Deal program interviewed more than 2,000 formerly enslaved people across 17 states, recording their testimonies about life under slavery. The people interviewed were by that point elderly. Most of them had been children when emancipated. But what they remembered and what they shared was extraordinary. Names, relationships, specific places, and specific events. The interior life of enslaved communities that the official record had never been designed to capture. Those testimonies, preserved in the Library of Congress and now digitized and searchable online, represent one of the most important counter-archives to the official erasure we have been examining. They do not fill all the gaps. They do not restore all the names. But they demonstrate, with the force of individual human voices speaking across nearly a century of time, that the erasure was never complete, that the people the system tried to reduce to numbers insisted on remaining people, that the names the census refused to record were remembered anyway, carried forward in the minds and mouths of the communities that refused to forget them until they could finally be written down by researchers who understood their value. The voices in those testimonies are one of the most important historical documents the United States possesses. And they are voices that the 1850 slave schedule tried, in its cold and bureaucratic way, to prevent from ever being heard.
There is a legal concept that has been at the center of debates about historical injustice in the United States for decades. And it is a concept that becomes almost unbearably relevant when examined in the context of the 1850 slave schedule and the erasure we have been tracing through this entire examination. The concept is standing. In American law, standing refers to the right of a party to bring a case before a court. To have standing, you must be able to demonstrate that you have suffered a specific, concrete injury that the court has the power to redress. You must be able to show not just that something wrong was done, but that the wrong was done to you specifically, in a way that caused you specifically a harm that can be identified and measured and potentially remedied. The requirement of standing has been one of the most significant obstacles to legal efforts to address the harms caused by American slavery and its aftermath. Because the people who were most directly harmed, the enslaved people themselves, are no longer alive to bring cases. And their descendants, who carry the consequences of those harms in their lives and their communities and their genealogical records, have repeatedly found courts unwilling to recognize the connection between the original injury and the present-day harm as sufficiently direct and specific to confer legal standing. The injury happened too long ago. The chain of causation is too long. The harm cannot be precisely measured. The people who caused it are dead. The courts have found in case after case that however morally compelling the argument for redress may be, the legal framework does not provide a mechanism for addressing harms of this nature and this age. But here is what makes the erasure in the 1850 slave schedule particularly interesting from a legal perspective, and what has made it a focus of attention for scholars who think about the intersection of historical injustice and contemporary law. The harm caused by the erasure of names from the census is not merely a historical harm, it is an ongoing one. The blank space in the ledger is not a closed wound, it is an open one. Every day that a descendant of an enslaved person is unable to document their genealogy because the official record was designed not to document it, the harm is occurring in the present tense. Every day that a community is unable to make legal claims that require genealogical documentation because that documentation was deliberately prevented from existing, the harm continues. The original act of erasure in 1850 is not something that happened and then stopped. It is something that happened and then kept happening across generations, in cascading and compounding forms. This argument has been made in various forms by legal scholars, historians, and advocates for reparations, and it represents a fundamentally different way of framing the question of historical injustice than the more common framing that courts have found unpersuasive. Rather than saying, something terrible was done to our ancestors and we deserve compensation for that historical wrong, the argument says, something was done to our ancestors that continues to cause specific, measurable, ongoing harm to us today, and the ongoing nature of that harm is itself sufficient to establish standing. The erasure did not end in 1850. It did not end with emancipation. It is still happening every time a researcher hits the wall, every time a family cannot document what it knows to be true, every time a community cannot prove its history because the official record was designed to prevent that proof from existing. This framing has not yet achieved widespread acceptance in American courts. The legal and political obstacles to reparations and historical redress remain formidable, and the standing question is only one of many. But the intellectual framework it represents is important beyond its immediate legal applications, because it insists on understanding historical injustice not as something that happened in the past and is now over, requiring only acknowledgement and perhaps apology, but as something that has a present tense reality with present tense consequences that can be identified, measured, and potentially addressed. It insists on the connection between then and now that comfortable narratives of historical progress prefer to sever. The connection between then and now is nowhere more concrete than in the specific, documented disparities in wealth and economic security between Black and white Americans that researchers have been mapping for decades. The racial wealth gap in the United States is one of the most studied and most persistent features of American economic life. Black families hold, on average, a fraction of the wealth held by white families of comparable income. That gap is not a coincidence. It is not the result of individual choices or cultural differences or the operation of a neutral market. It is the result of specific historical policies that deliberately and systematically prevented Black Americans from accumulating wealth across generations. And those policies did not begin with redlining or discriminatory lending,
or the destruction of prosperous black communities like Tulsa's Greenwood District in 1921. They began with slavery itself, with the fact that the labor of enslaved people generated enormous wealth that was captured entirely by the people who claimed to own them, and passed down through generations of white families whose descendants are still benefiting from it today. With the fact that emancipation came without the land redistribution that would have given formerly enslaved people the economic foundation to build on. With the fact that the Freedmen's Bureau, the closest thing to a restorative justice program that post-Civil War America produced, was dismantled before it could achieve its purpose. The 1850 slave schedule sits at the beginning of this chain of dispossession. It is the document that recorded the wealth represented by enslaved people as the property of their enslavers, formally and officially, in a government census designed to count and categorize the assets of American households. The enslaved people in that schedule were counted not as people whose labor generated wealth, but as assets that constituted wealth. Their bodies were the investment, their labor was the return, and their names were irrelevant to that calculation, which is precisely why their names were not recorded. But the names were not irrelevant to the people who bore them. The names were everything. They were the most basic form of identity, the most fundamental assertion of personhood, the most irreducible evidence that a human being existed as an individual rather than as a unit of economic productivity. And the decision to erase those names from the official record was not just an administrative choice about what information to include on a census form. It was a statement about whose existence was considered worth documenting, about whose individuality was considered real, about whose humanity was considered sufficiently established to warrant the ink. That statement was wrong. It was wrong in 1850, and it is wrong today. And recognizing it as wrong requires us to do something that the comfortable narratives of American history have generally been reluctant to do. It requires us to look directly at the system, not just at individual bad actors within it, and to say clearly that the system was designed to produce this outcome, that the erasure was not a failure of the system, it was the system working as intended, and that understanding what it was designed to do is the only honest foundation from which we can begin to understand what its consequences have been, and what, if anything, we are prepared to do about them.
There is a school in Charleston, South Carolina, that sits on land that was once part of a rice plantation. The school has been there for decades, serving the children of a neighborhood that has changed considerably over the generations, but retains, in its oldest residents, and in the specific texture of its community memory, a connection to that land that no amount of development or demographic change has entirely severed. A few years ago, a history teacher at that school began a project that she described to colleagues as simply trying to make the past visible. She wanted her students, most of whom were black, many of whom had family roots in that specific part of South Carolina going back generations, to understand not just the broad outlines of slavery as a historical institution, but the specific, local human reality of what had happened on the land beneath the building where they sat every day. She started with the 1850 slave schedule. She printed out the entries for the plantation that had once occupied the land. She put them on desks in front of her students. Rows of numbers, ages, a column for sex, a column for color as described by the census taker, and the blank space where names should have been. She did not say anything at first. She let her students look at the documents in silence, and then she asked them a question that she later described as the most important question she had ever asked in a classroom. She asked them to count the children. Her students counted, and what they found in those rows of numbers was that more than a third of the enslaved people listed on that plantation in 1850 were under the age of 15. Children. Some of them the same age as the students sitting in that classroom, looking at those documents, counting. And the room, she said, went very quiet. Not the restless, distracted quiet of students waiting for class to be over, the specific quiet of young people encountering something real for the first time, something that reached through the distance of history and made contact with their present moment in a way that changed the texture of the air in the room. One of her students, a 15-year-old girl whose family had lived in that part of Charleston for at least 4 generations, asked a question that the teacher said she has thought about every day since. The girl looked at the document, at the blank space where a name should have been beside the entry for a girl listed as 15 years old, and she asked, "Does that mean nobody remembers her?" And the teacher had to be honest. She said the official record does not remember her, but that is not the same thing as nobody remembering her. And then she turned the project into something larger than she had originally planned. She turned it into a recovery effort.
She brought in a genealogical researcher who specialized in African American family history. She connected with the local historical society. She reached out to elderly community members who carried oral histories of the area. And over the course of a semester, her students began the work of trying to find, in the fragments that had survived, the names that the census had refused to record. They did not find all of them. They did not find most of them. But they found some. A name in a church record. A name in an estate inventory filed in the Charleston courthouse. A name in a Freedmen's Bureau registration from 1866 that matched, in age and location and circumstantial detail, an entry in the 1850 slave schedule. And each name they found they wrote on the wall of their classroom. Not the census numbers. The names. The actual names of the actual people who had lived on the actual land beneath their feet. Celia. James. Hannah. Robert. Mary. A wall of names. Growing over the course of a semester. Each one representing hours of research and the accumulated weight of fragmentary evidence carefully assembled and honestly qualified. That wall of names is one of the most powerful educational artifacts produced in an American classroom in recent memory. Not because it solved the problem of the erasure. It did not. The names on that wall represent a tiny fraction of the people who were listed as numbers in the 1850 slave schedule for that plantation. The blank spaces still vastly outnumber the recovered names, but because of what the act of recovery itself demonstrated to the students who undertook it. It demonstrated that the erasure was not inevitable, that it was a choice, that choices have consequences, and that other choices, made now, with the tools and the will and the moral clarity that the original system lacked, can begin, imperfectly and incompletely but genuinely, to undo some of what was done. This is the pedagogical insight that the best educators working with this history have arrived at independently and expressed in different ways. The point is not to make students feel guilty or hopeless or overwhelmed by the scale of the injustice. The point is to make them understand that the injustice was the product of specific decisions made by specific people within a specific system, and that understanding the decisions clearly is the first step to making different decisions now. The 1850 slave schedule did not erase names because erasure was inevitable. It erased names because the people who designed it decided that the names were not worth recording. And that decision can be examined, and criticized, and refused. And the refusal can take the form of research, of recovery, of the patient and difficult work of finding the names that were left out, and writing them back into the record. This work is happening at every level of American society right now. From individual families searching genealogical databases, to university research projects digitizing plantation records, to congressional efforts to expand funding for the preservation and accessibility of historical documents relevant to African American history. The National Museum of African American History and Culture, which opened on the National Mall in Washington in 2016, has made the documentation and preservation of African American genealogical history one of its central missions. The museum's genealogy resources and its partnerships with research institutions across the country represent a national-level commitment to the recovery project that individual researchers and community organizations have been pursuing for decades. And the Freedmen's Bureau Records Transcription Project, which has engaged hundreds of thousands of volunteer transcribers in the work of making those documents searchable by name, has demonstrated something important about the appetite that exists in American society for this kind of recovery work. People want to do it. They volunteer their time in extraordinary numbers to sit at their computers and transcribe handwritten documents from the 1860s because they understand, at some level, that the work matters. That it is not merely academic. That every name transcribed is a small act of restoration, a small refusal of the erasure, a small insistence that the people who were counted as numbers were in fact people with names and histories, and descendants who deserve to know where they came from. The 15-year-old girl in that Charleston classroom asked whether anyone remembered the girl listed in the census as 15 years old with no name beside her entry. The honest answer is that the official record does not. But the honest answer also includes everything we have examined in this long and difficult journey through the archives and the oral histories, and the courthouse records, and the plantation ledgers. The honest answer includes Dorothy Redford and her 2,000 descendants gathering at Somerset Place. It includes the Federal Writers Project interviewers and the formerly enslaved people who told them their stories. It includes the genealogical researchers who spend their careers on the other side of the slavery research barrier. It includes the students who wrote names on a classroom wall in Charleston. It includes everyone who has refused to accept that the blank space in the ledger is the final word on the existence of the people it failed to name. The official record does not remember her. But we are trying to. And the trying matters.
We have come a long way from that opening image, the census taker on horseback, moving through the summer heat of 1850, carrying his official government forms from plantation to plantation, writing down numbers where names should have been. We have followed the consequences of that choice through courthouses and archives and plantation ledgers and oral histories and genealogical databases and classroom walls covered and recovered names. We have examined the legal framework that made the erasure possible, the economic logic that made it desirable, the human resistance that made it incomplete, and the ongoing work that is slowly, imperfectly, making it less total than it was designed to be. And now we arrive at the place where all of this examination has been leading. Not a conclusion exactly, because the story we have been telling does not have a conclusion. It has a present tense, and the present tense requires something from us that a conclusion does not. It requires a reckoning, not in the abstract political sense in which that word is sometimes used, as a synonym for a national conversation, or a moment of reflection, or a symbolic gesture of acknowledgement. A reckoning in the specific, concrete sense of looking directly at what happened, understanding clearly why it happened, tracing honestly where its consequences have traveled, and asking seriously what it would mean to take those consequences seriously in the present moment. That kind of reckoning is harder than a conversation. It is harder than acknowledgement. It requires same with discomfort long enough to let the discomfort do its work, long enough to let it change something. The 1850 slave schedule listed approximately 3.2 million human beings without recording a single one of their names. 3.2 million. That number is so large that it resists imagination. It is easier to think about Celia, the 7-year-old in Tensas Parish, the 15-year-old on the Charleston plantation, whose name a student went looking for 170 years later, the 3-month-old whose entry in a government ledger represented the entirety of her official existence in the eyes of the United States government. These individual fragments of the larger story are where the imagination can get traction, where the number becomes something the mind can hold and feel the weight of, and that is where the reckoning has to begin. Not with 3.2 million, though 3.2 million is the truth of the scale. With one. With the specific, individual, irreplaceable human being behind each number in each column of each page of that schedule. Because here is what we know about every single one of those 3.2 million entries. Every single one of them had a name. Not a name assigned by an enslaver, not necessarily, though many of them had those as well. A name that meant something within their community. A name that connected them to their parents and their parents' parents, and the long chain of human relationship and memory that every person carries whether the official record acknowledges it or not. Every single one of those 3.2 million people was known by someone, was loved by someone, had a history that extended before the moment the census taker arrived, and would extend after for however long they lived, and in however many people carried the memory of them forward. The government of the United States chose not to record any of that, chose to reduce 3.2 million individual human beings, each with a name and a history and a community and an inner life, to a set of numbers in a column beneath the name of the person who claimed to own them. That choice was not a bureaucratic oversight. It was a moral position. It was a statement about whose existence was considered worth documenting, about whose individuality was considered real, about whose humanity was sufficiently established to warrant the ink of official recognition. And that statement was wrong in 1850. It remains wrong today. And the wrongness of it does not diminish with the passage of time. It accumulates. What does it mean to take that accumulated wrongness seriously in the present moment? It means, at minimum, supporting the recovery work, the genealogical research, the archival digitization projects, the oral history collections, the educational initiatives that bring this history into classrooms and make it visible and real for the students who will carry it forward. It means understanding that this work is not optional, not supplementary, not a niche concern for specialists.
It is a matter of basic historical honesty, of insisting that the official record, wherever possible, reflect the reality of what happened, rather than the interests of those who designed the official record in the first place. It means listening when descendants of enslaved people describe the specific present-tense harm of not being able to document their own family history, not responding with the comfortable observation that this all happened a long time ago, because a long time ago is not the same as over. The blank space in the ledger is still blank. The wall is still there. The names are still missing from the official record. The harm is still accumulating. And the fact that it began a long time ago does not diminish the reality that it is continuing now, in the lives of real people who are navigating a world that was shaped by decisions made before they were born, and that continue to shape what they can know and prove and claim about themselves. And it means, perhaps most fundamentally, refusing the comfortable narrative that separates then from now, that treats the 1850 slave schedule as a historical artifact, regrettable but safely contained in the past, without consequences that extend into the present. Because that narrative is false. The consequences extend. The blank spaces persist. The wall stands. And the work of crossing it, of recovering the names that were left out, of insisting on the personhood that the system denied, is not finished. It will not be finished until every name that can be recovered has been recovered, and every descendant who wants to know where they come from has access to whatever fragments of that knowledge survive the erasure. That is a long and difficult and perhaps never fully completable project, but it is the right one. It is the one that honesty requires. It is the one that the 3-month-old in Tensa's parish, and Celia in the plantation ledger, and the 15-year-old on the Charleston land, and 3.2 million others whose names were considered not worth recording, deserve to have undertaken on their behalf. Their names were never recorded, but they existed. They mattered, and the least we can do, 170 years later, is say so.